Hello, I'm Christine Jenkins, and I'm reading from Annie on My Mind by Nancy Garden. On the subway, Annie's mood changed, and mine did too. After we sat down, Annie whispered, "Have you ever stared at people's noses on the subway till they don't make any sense anymore?" I said I hadn't, and then of course both stared all the way to South Ferry till people began scowling at us and moving uncomfortably away. We rode back and forth on the Staten Island ferry for the rest of the afternoon, sometimes pretending we were going through the Panama Canal to California, sometimes pretending we were going to Greece, where I was going to show Annie the Parthenon. "Only if I can give you history lessons as well as architecture lessons," she said, "even if they hardly ever teach it at all in my stupid school." "How come you know so much then?" I said, thinking of our improvisations. "I read a lot," she said, and we both laughed. After about 4 trips back and forth, the ferry crew caught on that we'd only paid once, so the next time we pulled into St. George, Staten Island, we got off and hiked up one of the hilly streets that lead away from the ferry slips till we got to some houses with little yards in front of them. Annie said, serious again, "I'd like to live in a house with a yard someday, wouldn't you?" And I said, "Yes." And for a while we played a quiet, shy, too, game of which of the houses we'd like to live in if we could. Then we sat down on a stone wall at the corner of someone's yard. It was beginning to get dark by then, and we were silent for a while. "We're in Richmond," Annie said suddenly, startling me. "We're early settlers, and—" Then she stopped, and I could feel, rather than see, that she was shaking her head. "No," she said softly, "I don't want to do that with you so much anymore." "Do what?" "You know, unicorns, maidens and knights, staring at noses even. I don't want to pretend anymore. You make me want to be real." I was looking for some way to answer, but when a woman came by from a house across the street carrying a mesh shopping bag and leading a little dog on a leash. When she reached the corner, she put the shopping bag into the dog's mouth and said, "Good, Pixie, good girl, carry the bag for Mommy." And we both burst into helpless laughter. When we stopped laughing, I said awkwardly, "I'm glad you want to be real, but please don't be too real. I mean—" Annie gave me a funny look and said, "Annie Kenyon's dull, huh?" "No," I protested. "No, not dull at all. Annie Kenyon's—" "What? Annie Kenyon's what?" I wanted to say fascinating, because that's what I was thinking, but I was too embarrassed. Instead, I said, "Interesting." But that sounded flat, and I knew Annie couldn't see my face clearly in the twilight anyway, so I added, "Fascinating, after all." I thought, magical, too, but I didn't say that, even though I was just sitting there in the growing darkness with Annie was so special and so unlike anything that had ever happened to me before that magical seemed like a good word for it, and for her. "Oh, Liza," Annie said, in a way I was beginning to expect and hope for, and then she said, "So are you." And I said stupidly, "So am I what?" Instead of answering, Annie pointed down the street to where Pixie and Mommy were coming back. Then, when I was looking at them, the streetlights were on now. Annie said very softly, "Fascinating." Pixie was still carrying the shopping bag, but now it had a head of lettuce in it. Pixie was so low to the ground that the bag was bumping along the sidewalk. "I hope," Annie said, "that Mommy's planning to wash that lettuce." We sat huddled together on the wall in the shadow of some big trees, watching until Pixie and Mommy were back inside their house, and then we walked back down the ferry slip, shoulders touching. I think one reason why we didn't move away from each other was because if we had, that would have been an acknowledgement that we were touching in the first place. We each called home to say we'd be late, and on the way back in the ferry, we stood as far up in the bow as we could, watching the lights of Manhattan twinkling closer and closer as we approached. We were the only people on deck. It was getting very cold. "Look," said Annie. She closed her hand on mine and pointed up with her other hand. "The stars match the lights. Look." It was true. There were 2 golden lacework patterns now, one in the sky and one on shore, complementing each other. "There's your world," Annie said softly, pointing to the Manhattan skyline, gold filigree in the distance. "Real, but sometimes beautiful," I said, aware that I was liking Annie's hand touching mine, but not thinking beyond that. "And that's my world," Annie pointed up to the stars again. "Inaccessible." "Not," I said to her softly, to unicorns. Nothing's inaccessible to unicorns, not even white birds. Annie smiled as if more to herself than to me and looked toward Manhattan again, the wind from the ferry's motion blowing her hair around her face. And here we are, she said, Liza and Annie, suspended in between. We stood there in the bow for the whole rest of the trip, watching the stars and the shore lights. It was only when the ferry began to dock in Manhattan that we moved apart and dropped each other's hands.